In 1957, deep in the swamplands of Louisiana, in a town so small it barely appeared on maps, there lived a woman named Eleanor Dumont, known to her neighbors as a quiet widow who ran a modest boarding house. Yet behind the peeling paint of her home and the carefully closed curtains, Eleanor carried a secret so disturbing that even decades later, historians struggle to explain how an entire town failed to stop it. Because Eleanor was not simply renting rooms. She was systematically exploiting vulnerable women who came to her door seeking shelter, safety, and work. And over the course of nearly 20 years, she built a hidden operation that thrived on silence, fear, and the desperate need for survival. And it all began when the post-war economy left thousands displaced, especially young women fleeing broken homes, abusive families, or poverty. Many of whom traveled south chasing rumors of factory jobs and domestic work, only to find doors closed and resources gone. And when they reached Eleanor's boarding house, she appeared kind, offering warm meals, a clean bed, and promises of work connections. But the kindness was a mask, because what Eleanor truly offered was control, and she enforced it not through physical chains but through emotional dependency, isolation, and manipulation. Slowly convincing each woman that she owed Eleanor for her survival, for her safety, for her very life, and once that belief took root, Eleanor began to use them, sending them to wealthy men in nearby towns under the guise of employment opportunities, convincing them that compliance was the price of stability. And when any woman resisted, Eleanor would remind her of her lack of options, of her distance from home, of her non-existent support system, and of the local police chief who happened to be Eleanor's cousin. And so the women stayed, and the operation continued, hidden not behind locked doors but behind trust that had been twisted into submission. And for years, Eleanor's boarding house was known as a place where women came and never seemed to leave. Yet the town dismissed it as coincidence, or blamed the women themselves, labeling them transient, unreliable, or morally questionable. Because in that era, society often judged women harshly while ignoring the systems that exploited them. And Eleanor used that prejudice to her advantage, carefully selecting women with no family nearby, no money, no legal knowledge, and no social standing. And she kept meticulous records, writing names, dates, and payments in a leather-bound ledger hidden beneath the floorboards of her bedroom, where every transaction was recorded not as a crime but as a business. And she grew wealthy enough to expand her home, add new rooms, and purchase properties under false names, yet she continued living modestly, maintaining the illusion of a struggling widow, which made her seem harmless, forgettable, and unworthy of suspicion. And the women who lived under her roof learned to survive by becoming invisible, speaking softly, keeping their heads down, and doing exactly what Eleanor instructed, because resistance brought punishment. Not necessarily physical harm, but something far more terrifying, abandonment. And Eleanor knew that for women who had already been abandoned by family, society, and systems, being cast back into the streets felt like a death sentence, so they stayed. And some even began to defend Eleanor, convincing themselves that she was helping them survive in a cruel world. And this psychological control was the most powerful weapon Eleanor wielded, because it erased her victim's sense of choice, replacing it with obligation, fear, and loyalty born from trauma. And over time, some of the women aged out of Eleanor's operation, becoming less useful in her eyes, and instead of releasing them, she forced them into roles as enforcers, housekeepers, and recruiters, sending them into bus stations, shelters, and church kitchens to find new arrivals who looked lost, frightened, and alone. And these women, trapped in survival mode, became unwilling participants in expanding the very system that trapped them, creating a cycle of exploitation that fed itself. And the town, though not entirely blind, chose not to see, because Eleanor donated generously to churches, hosted community dinners, and supported local politicians, embedding herself into the fabric of the town so deeply that questioning her meant questioning the town itself. And when rumors occasionally surfaced, they were dismissed as gossip, jealousy, or misunderstandings, because Eleanor's reputation as a helpful widow overshadowed the whispers. And the women who tried to speak out were either ignored, discredited, or quietly encouraged to leave town, which Eleanor often arranged herself, paying for bus tickets to distant cities, ensuring they disappeared without leaving a trail. And for nearly 2 decades, her operation thrived in plain sight, hidden not by darkness, but by social indifference, until in 1976, a young woman named Marlene Carter arrived at the boarding house, fleeing an abusive household in Arkansas. And unlike the others, Marlene kept a journal, writing every detail of her days, not because she suspected danger, but because writing was her way of holding on to her identity. And as Eleanor's control tightened, Marlene's journal filled with contradictions between kindness and coercion. And unlike many before her, Marlene had grown up reading true crime novels and newspapers, and she began to sense patterns, noticing how women arrived but never stayed long, how Eleanor's instructions grew more specific, and how certain men's names appeared repeatedly in conversations behind closed doors. And when Marlene questioned Eleanor directly, Eleanor responded not with anger, but with tears, portraying herself as a misunderstood widow doing her best to survive. And this emotional manipulation nearly worked, because Eleanor was skilled at playing the victim. But Marlene noticed something Eleanor had overlooked, the ledger. And one night, while Eleanor slept, Marlene pried loose a floorboard and found the leather-bound book filled with names, payments, and dates, written in careful handwriting, documenting nearly 20 years of exploitation. And Marlene realized that this was not chaos, not survival, not desperation, but an organized system of abuse. And she understood that if she did nothing, the cycle would continue, and if she acted, she might not survive the consequences, but she chose to act, because silence had already taken too much from too many. And Marlene copied the ledger, page by page, hiding the notes inside the lining of her coat. And then, instead of fleeing immediately, she waited, because she knew that running without evidence would only turn her into another missing woman, whose story would be dismissed. And she needed a moment when Eleanor could not control the narrative. And that moment came when a fire broke out in the neighboring building, drawing police and emergency services into the area. And while the town's attention was focused elsewhere, Marlene walked into the sheriff's office and placed the copied ledger on the front desk, calmly stating that a crime had been occurring for nearly 20 years under the town's nose. And initially, the officers dismissed her, assuming she was another troubled woman making accusations against a respected citizen. But when a young deputy began reading the pages, he recognized several names, not of the women, but of prominent men in the community, including businessmen, politicians, and donors. And the mood in the room changed, because this was no longer a single woman accusing a widow. This was evidence of a network. And though corruption still attempted to bury the truth, the scale of the ledger made suppression impossible, because Marlene had already mailed copies to newspapers in neighboring states, ensuring that the story could not be contained within the town's boundaries. And when reporters arrived, Eleanor's carefully constructed image collapsed under the weight of documented evidence, survivor testimonies, and financial records that showed money flowing through shell accounts connected to her properties. And though Eleanor denied everything, portraying herself as a victim of conspiracy and defamation, the ledger spoke louder than her words. And for the first time, the women who had lived under her roof were heard, some stepping forward publicly, others anonymously, each story revealing a pattern of manipulation, isolation, and psychological coercion. And though many feared retaliation, the presence of national media created a shield of visibility that Eleanor could not penetrate. And in 1978, she was arrested on multiple charges related to exploitation, coercion, and illegal financial operations, though the legal system struggled to categorize her crimes because many of her actions existed in the gray areas of consent shaped by desperation, power imbalance, and manipulation. Yet the court recognized that consent obtained through isolation, fear, and dependency was not true consent at all, and Eleanor was convicted, though her sentence was tragically light, reflecting the limitations of the legal framework of that time. And she died in prison years later, largely forgotten by the public, but never forgotten by the women whose lives she had shaped. And Marlene Carter, though she survived, carried the emotional weight of her experience for the rest of her life, becoming an advocate for survivors, working with shelters, social workers, and lawmakers to reform laws related to exploitation, trafficking, and coercion, ensuring that future victims would have stronger legal protection. And her journal, along with the copied ledger, is now preserved in a university archive as a case study in how abuse can thrive not through violence alone, but through social systems that reward silence, ignore vulnerability, and protect power. And today, Eleanor Dumont's story is studied not as an isolated evil, but as a warning about how exploitation hides behind respectability and kindness, and how predators often wear kindness as a disguise, and how communities, when unwilling to confront uncomfortable truths, become accomplices through inaction. And though this story occurred decades ago, its relevance has only grown, because modern forms of exploitation often look less like chains and more like contracts, less like imprisonment and more like dependency. And Marlene's decision to speak remains a reminder that change rarely begins with institutions, but with individuals who refuse silence. And her story continues to resonate not because it is shocking, but because it is disturbingly plausible, reflecting patterns still seen today in trafficking networks, abusive workplaces, coercive relationships, and systems that prey on vulnerability. And as historians, psychologists, And advocates continue to analyze Eleanor Dumont's operation. They emphasize that the most dangerous environments are not always the darkest or most hidden, but often the most ordinary, blending seamlessly into everyday life. Because evil does not always announce itself, it often arrives quietly, offering help, shelter, and safety. And it is only later that the cost becomes clear, and the legacy of this story is not the downfall of one woman, but the awakening of many, the recognition that exploitation is not a relic of the past but a present reality, and that vigilance, education, and compassion remain the strongest defenses against systems that profit from silence, fear, and forgotten lives.